Welcome to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social actions, spark creativity, and bring surprising new tastes to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrivka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities, from macro to micro, from societal to cellular, and from global to personal. Have you ever seen a kombucha SCOBY? It has an acidic smell, meaty consistency, and slimy surface. It floats in a yellowish liquid with brown sediments. Oh, and all these features intensify if you let it ferment for too long. Some might say, "Ew, gross!" But many other fermented foods and beverages can look yucky too. What exactly is this feeling of disgust? Where does it come from? In this episode with Adrien Rigobello, we discuss gross, this particular feeling of repulsion and fascination. Adrien is a Ph.D. researcher working with Fungal Architectures at the Royal Danish Academy and founder of FREDS, a medialab for social resilience. In our conversation, we often refer to the paper Designing the Gross in Search for Social Inclusion that Adrien co-wrote with Nadia Gudierre-Jam. But we also talk about xenodesign, engaging with the unknown, designing with living systems, and treating kombucha and mushrooms mycelium as materials. But let's go to the yucky part first. What is the most disgusting for you, Adrien? Is there something in particular that brings this emotion?
I think so. We wrote about it. We wrote about the growth, obviously in regards to kombucha and material. But actually, while doing the state of the art or review of the works of art that were referring to these emotions, I think one of the most, the one that disgusted me the most is the violence that one of the artists had to endure, and she has put herself in this situation. I can't remember right now her name. I think it's Reason Zero, the title of the work, and it was a performance. Abramovich, I think, was the name of the artist, and eventually she was just laying in a stage. I think she was probably naked and leaving for the audience to just come and do whatever to her. And eventually people got very violent on her. And this to me was probably the most disgusting. So it's not so much about the grossness of the kombucha at this point, but mainly more about the grossness of violence and unpredictability of the human behavior.
In your paper, you call, I wrote down here this one line: wet, slimy, sticky, moldy, rotten, spoiled, decaying, smelly, gross. So what is actually gross, or what is the particular angle which interests you the most?
Basically, when we so the way we define it in the paper was that grossness was the combination of both disgust and fascination. So basically, it's say when you would see something that is slimy or I don't know, like very other to you, but you can't help but be interested by it. So it's not something that you want to disregard or to just remove your look from, but basically eventually engage with, that you want to discover. I don't know if we wrote it in those terms somewhere, but I think it's the complete otherness of something.
And if we apply this notion of something gross to the design, what does it bring to us? What kind of design it is?
That's quite an interesting question. But I think it's mainly about engaging with something that one is not familiar with. And I think growth is probably also a provocation, saying, well, why should we resort to growth? Because eventually we want also to question, at least question, dominant models and biases that are being conveyed in everyday's designs.
Yeah, I think it struck me quite a lot that this notion of grossness it's a social construct at the end. And if something is a social construct, then it could be used in the way to create the divisions
Mhm.
and to create power structures. Actually, it was the first time I read the term xenodesign. I know the both kind of parts of the word, but I haven't heard before about like xenodesign itself. I would like you to explain us what is xenodesign and also how it connects to design with growth.
Mm. So I have to admit that it's not a practice of design that I have seen a lot of works from or referring to. I discovered this term thanks to Adrien Rigobello that I met probably a year and a half ago. Basically, she was referring to it. I mean, she wrote actually a very interesting paper about the prefix xeno, which is other, and how in queer philosophy or queer materialities, this prefix is also kind of a statement. I mean, she wrote this really interesting piece that is almost trying to be exhaustive about this prefix and combine with different suffixes what it can mean. So she also talks about xenodesign. I think in her practice, she's referring to it also as the materialities and the chemicals that are linked to queer ways of being, which can be very wide, and that belongs to this community in a way, or tries to be part of the language of this community. So I don't belong to this community, but I borrowed the term also because I feel that the works that I just mentioned that are about using provocative materialities are also in a way referring to that in the way I understand it. And the way I understand it is basically what we are interested in with Naja, co-author of the paper, is also inclusive design and how to basically try to understand how do we understand firstly the semiotics of the existing designs that are supposedly for the norm, which is something that is quite interesting, I think, in design because design is also quite often, I mean, less and less in speculative design, but quite often still referring to industrial design and the necessity to produce in volumes and sales or marketing and things like that. So there is a notion of eye candiness in a way, or the pleasing of the mind, the comforting zone in the design genetics that we feel as designers is also very important to question. So I would say it's not to reappropriate ourselves this term of design. We try to be a bit precautious about using it because it's a bit scarce, the usage of it. And it's also to make it, I mean, part of the language of design, basically, at least to make one question, what is that?
We didn't talk about it yet, but also the paper itself comes from the practice of the NGO you were involved with, the Threads.
Mhm.
One of the projects you work there with is kombucha as the example of the growth design. I would like to hear more about how this NGO came into being and what do you work on within that, and of course about the growth kombucha research too.
Yeah, so basically, Threads is, I mean, the way we like to define it is that it's an NGO design studio, and we kind of focus on inclusive design. I mean, that's one side that we feel is quite urgent. I mean, it's basically design is such a powerful medium or practice, rather, with methodologies that reach out or that span over very different types of media. We basically understand that it extends to architecture, which is also benefiting from a very different academic practice corpus. So basically, that's what we are trying to look at. So both in terms of analytical practices for us, so trying to understand, say, the semiotics behind the design, but also it very much anchors into practice. And the width of this practice that we try to have at Threads also comes with the very wide variety of profiles that are within the studio. So we have makers that have been working with kids that have dropped out of school, so very specific and tough sort of context. But we also work with people that are doing a career in academia. Sorry. Basically, we all do that, but with the same sort of motivation that is to firstly have fun, I would say, but also put this fun to the service of something that we feel is useful and fair. Basically, I think it was in 2017, we did a small contest that is called Reshape, where we proposed an alternative design for an hospital gown entirely made of kombucha. So it had the form of a kimono, and for this, I mean, it was actually the first time I was doing kombucha myself. So we basically grew a 4 meter square pellicle. I mean, we were quite fortunate, and we won this contest, and we started to pull the thread. Yeah, so we established a workshop in the city of Saint Denis. Since then, we've been continuing to research on it, on the more experimental side of it, like developing open source methodologies for making it waterproof, but also trying to understand how we can produce with one system both the drink kombucha and the pellicle kombucha, which is counterintuitive in a way. I mean, in the way it's produced. Yeah, and then this paper, Designing the Growth, is also the result somehow of these 2 years of research, I think.
When you now describe that you were growing kombucha, I imagine you had some pool, right? Or what was the setup for it?
So the setup was quite frugal. So it was basically 4 wood slabs and a garden plastic sheet, so quite thick. And this made basically a pool of 5 centimeters deep, 2 meters of 2 meters side, a square. Yeah, that was it. Then eventually we just add another plastic sheet to cover the hole, and we left it in a workshop basically. And I mean, it's probably the pellicle that with which we had the best quality. It's kind of interesting for us also to be able to do that. And I think there is also something that motivates us to continue to research on the practical side. Most people that work with kombucha will say, well, it's not possible to industrialize that or to scale up the production of kombucha. Yeah, even though it's the pellicle is a material that is very stiff, very strong, and that can, I mean, it's basically 15 times stronger in tensile strength to cause leather, which is something that is probably worth investigating in terms of scale up. It's basically very sustainable. So yeah, I think it's also sort of a challenge that we've set to ourselves to improve that, but at the same time make it available to people that might need it the most.
Did you drink also the kombucha from that pool, or it was not possible to do that?
Uh, I think the smell made us a bit, yeah,
This was too gross.
it was definitely too gross. Yeah, yeah. I mean, normally when you do the drink, it's what 7 days fermentation, and here it was probably 25 days in summer. So yeah, it was a bit acidic, I would say.
Sorry to ask you such a detailed questions, but as I also grow kombucha at home, but of course the scale is much smaller. I am just, my imagination goes wild when I hear about the size of the pool you had. But what about the fruit flies? Did you have problem with them?
Not much. We've had that in our workshop later in summers when it was very hot and it was not super isolated from outside. But for this one, not so much actually. I mean, a few still, but not. It was a clean workshop. We were quite lucky to have it.
Did you manage to prevent this dried kombucha from being destroyed by water?
Basically, what we I mean, the way we treat it is by I mean, it's similar to wood protection. A wood craft person that gave us such advice to try that. So it's basically mixing linen oil, turpentine, and beeswax. I mean, in a way to keep it the less viscous possible, so that it really migrates within the cellulose matrix of the kombucha pellicle. We've had different results. We have never tried on a final piece of design, say a garment or such. One of our friend in the studio tried actually to make sort of a cup with that, and I think it was holding without absorbing water for probably like 15 minutes or such.
Something I realized, we are saying kombucha, kombucha, but we never said what is that, and maybe it would be worthy to still come back to it. What is kombucha, and how would you describe it to somebody who never yeah, saw it, drink it, never heard of it.
I think I would say that it's very similar to vinegar, but eventually it's symbiotic culture of one main species of yeast and one main species of bacteria. And the one of the bacteria that is interesting to us is taking a glucose and fructose, and it's weaving very thin fibrils of cellulose, and it's basically producing that on top of a sweet tea solution that is a bit acidic and it tends to be acidified by the system, by the culture. And basically, it's producing this cellulose mat at the interface with the air and the solution, and then it thickens with time. It's very slimy and it's very much alive. I think one of the most striking features of it is that when we did cultivation workshops, people would spontaneously give it names. I don't know if it comes from the sliminess of it.
It's a bit like a meat. I mean, I'm not eating meat, but this is my memory of meat, of some like chicken breasts or this kind of consistency.
I know that the restaurant Amas in Copenhagen, so they are doing fermentation. They have a cook. It's called Kim, and I don't know his last name, but we met him at some point and discussed about these things, kombucha and what you can do with it. He was very surprised that we were trying to make materials with that because he would eventually treat it or process it as one could eat it. I mean, that's food, and that's not whatever else. Like, you don't play with food like that. I was a bit shocked by it. I mean, for sure, curious. But yeah, people tend to eat it also in restaurants.
We know the current uses of kombucha, right? Like there is some research to use it in fashion. There is some research to create like objects, or I don't know, some other person will make a food out of it. But I wanted to fantasize in like a sci-fi manner how we could use kombucha in the future uses, like something which is not yet possible. Nobody's really thinking of it, but knowing the properties of this material, do you have any ideas what it could be used for?
Mm, um, I don't know if I'm very good at these exercises. I mean, I tend to be more on to grounded speculations, fortunately and unfortunately, I would say.
So then tell us about all the uses of kombucha you know. Let's make a contest to make a whole lineup of theirs.
I mean, the so basically what happens, what I described with the bacteria. I mean, we call it kombucha pellicle, but it's really bacterial cellulose what it's producing and what we are us interested in. But eventually, like in medical usages, you have lots of applications, and say one of the main one that stick with me is the fact that people are actually producing in labs, so not in workshops this time, these tiny tubes of bacterial cellulose, and they use it basically to replace parts of arteries, for instance, while they repair after a surgery. Also because it's cellulose, so the body can degrade them. I mean, some people are using it to serve as a matrix or as a substrate. I don't know how you say that, in order to build sensors. Not exactly as you would do a PCB, but apparently more as like binding into the matrix of the cellulose. I mean, there are quite extensive researches at the crossover between synthetic biology and, I don't know, materials or electronics engineering. One of the benefits of kombucha over lab-grown bacterial cellulose is that you don't need a lab. Obviously, the results, you control them probably a bit less, which is something that can be quite interesting, both to incentivize people to research on how to improve this reproducibility, firstly, but also to probably envision another way of referring to objects. Do we want to have completely standard objects? And I mean, we are working with some kombucha drinks producers in order to develop, say, packaging. So instead of using glue and a label with inks that would be polluting and such, the idea would be eventually to use kombucha pellicle instead. And basically, this kombucha pellicle is biodegradable. Yeah, I mean, at large, I think what's quite interesting with kombucha is that, well, you can grow it almost anywhere if it's rather clean, like in a kitchen, say, and basically over 20 degrees. Well, the next step is to say, well, actually, that's probably the one raw material that I can think of that we can produce within cities. So if we accept to have something that is less standard than what we are used to, socially, economically, it can also have, and culturally also, it can have sort of an impact also. And this is actually probably our first motivation for doing open source on what we are doing. I mean, eventually, when we get a bit more poetic about it, we tend to think about extending the term of terroir as designs also. Eventually, allowing to extend the argument of producing a material and so on to the cultural value that it has and the way people get together around craft practices.
If we would zoom out, we are talking a lot about designing with like living organisms and living systems. And besides this environmental obvious benefit that it's not polluting, it's biodegradable, is there anything else that would be calling for like research and attention to designing with living organisms? And I mean it broadly, since I know that you have also experience with growing with fungal mycelium and so on.
There are discussions about what this means, and quite often it lands on the argument of post-anthropocentric times. So how do we do after this sort of era that was a pinnacle of anthropocentrism in modernism? I mean, there are, I think, two ways in which this is unraveled at the time. So the first one is to use these terms and to resort to these living systems at large, so say mycelium, to do composites based on basically lignocellulosic substrates like woodish substrates, which is one of the most representative practices. So this plus kombucha are quite widespread. On this first path, I think it's a misuse of the term. I don't know if I would call that greenwashing in a way or post-anthropocentric washing. I mean, if the tool is still the object of the fascination of the person that investigates it, I'll say I'm doing mycelium composites not because it's grounded, but because I think I can engineer it to be like that and do a successful startup out of that. Well, I believe the motivations might be wrong and sort of anthropocentric. But this is more about, say, the motivation rather than the term. We quite often see discussions on how synthetic biology, which is actually not the case here, we are not doing synthetic biology, or the result to biological systems is a change in paradigm. It's probably a change in technical paradigm, but it's not a change in technical or design paradigm in the sense that it's basically the extension of this idea of modernism, where we functionalize for our own needs without caring for whatever else. I think the second argument or the second path that is developing at the time is also saying, well, let's be post-anthropocentric and let's try to think in terms of fungi welfare. I'm not sure about what this means. It surely is productive, but if we are designing something, we are not going to design tiny cars for fungi or brooms for yeast and such. I mean, we are still basically going to design for human uses. And my position is to say, well, try and think about what does it mean, the life of a non-human. But I would even say the fact that we consider it alive is quite interesting already. And in a way, it's not so much the non-humans that we need to negotiate with. It's other humans that we need to negotiate with. It's other persons that we need to convince that there are other ways to refer to nature. And basically, this all comes to building other ontologies of nature in my PhD works, which is situated within a EU project that's called Fungal Architectures. Basically, we try to do a fungal automaton at the architectural scale, which means that the fungi or the fungus, needs to be alive in order to be computable with. I mean, the objective of it that is laid out is quite modernist, isn't it? But the idea from the architectural perspective that my colleagues and me are sitting at or from, I think is also to take this as an opportunity to at least try and challenge the ontology of nature that exists and propose other paths like design and activable methods to propose alternatives.
Do I understand well that in this fungal architecture research you are part of, the fungal structure will be still alive when being in use, or the mushroom is being somehow, deactivated? I don't know how to even say it.
Well, no, the idea is very much for it to be alive. So basically, we are moving away from the state of the art of mycelium-based composites because, I mean, it's basically completely different what we are looking at. The objectives of it are very much different. I mean, not being a mycologist or an expert in it, I need to respect some kind of freedom and some kind of rhythm of the fungus. I will not over design, but it needs to make sense if the architectural intervention takes place in a natural site or a site that is not completely artificial. I mean, because there is this objective of making an automaton with fungus. So, what does this mean, and how? Like, what are we reading? What are we computing with? I mean, it's basically a Pandora box of questions. So, eventually, the idea is to interact with the fungus, to read the ecological behavior of the site, and basically to use that as an opportunity to design interactions in between humans and this ecological site so as to create some kind of awareness and be a way both in the techniques and in the design. I mean, the techniques involved in making this to convey some kind of, I would say, semiotics or intention that talks about the relationship to nature.
That's the major difference when designing with living organisms, that there is always this aspect of there is something outside of our control. And maybe that's why this kind of living systems were not really popular to be used kind of on an equal manner with humans, let's say, or at least not so kind of imposing human will on those living systems. Did you have some situations, for example, when growing kombucha, that you felt it is going out of your control?
um, all the time, I would say. And I mean, we need also to respect the way it evolves. And we can see, say, that after using the same mother strain of kombucha to grow several times, we see how it gets tired. Or, I mean, obviously, we only can interpret how it's doing with our perspective. So it's not the objective truth of how it's doing, but it's rather a sensitive way of trying to engage and see, well, this one is going in this direction and I cannot tune it anymore. So how am I going to work with that?
Do you sometimes dream of kombucha because it's kind of a creature and you work with it so much?
Yeah,
Some nightmares.
it's since I started the PhD, it's probably more about fungi at large rather than specifically kombucha. But I mean, I found it actually to be very productive at large, be it consciously or unconsciously. I think it's also an exercise in humility in some sense, or at least sensitivity, because I mean we can study the biology of kombucha as much as we want, and actually we are doing it as much as we can with threads. But you and I, for instance, don't need to know the full biology of the human body in order to interact with human body. We just use the behavioral condition, and that's probably the way we try also to engage with this system.
From my experience working with kombucha, or in general any living cultures, they have their own rhythm, and we do not have much influence on that. But I can just imagine that it's a very interesting, I don't know, element to take into account.
Working with living systems needs to be way more involved, I would say. But it's not an involvement that is like studying for 7 years plus, and like it's not hard. It's just a different perspective where one needs to be, I guess, more sensitive about it and more involved. I mean, I come from an engineering background, so I can say that working with those is really interesting. I would say to the way I was trained in Cartesian thinking.
What's the biggest difference?
I mean, it's basically refining the goals that one can have with such system of control. I have very little doubt that in the future there will be bacterial cellulose textiles that are very much democratized. But with the perspective of kombucha, because it's also a complex system that is both resilient but needs attention, such as with a pet, for instance, I know I was trained in industrial engineering, like looking at how to build standards and like meet strict intervals of quality in productions and things like that. And here it's basically a complete other position where quantifying is not the only way to go. Of course, we can quantify and apply some techniques. I mean, it's not that engineering is not useful anymore, but it's rather extending this position.
Did you know if kombucha and mycelium have been used as materials for a long time?
The fact that these crafts, so with the kombucha pellicles or with mycelium composites or whatever, can be for one to make in a kitchen, like in kitchen-like conditions, because eventually it's very similar to making bread. These crafts to build materials, to produce and form materials, are novel. Well, I mean, it's not novel to make bricks of mycelium. It's been out there for probably at least 150 years. And kombucha is basically known for what, 2000 years plus. Nothing is so new with these systems, but the fact of envisioning them as a way to make materials makes it quite interesting, because it's not like wood or leather, where we have centuries of practices and semiotics attached to that. Let's say, I mean, kombucha, for instance, is very novel and there is very little cultural value attached to it. So how do we, I mean, if we make clothes with that, the fact that it's not easy to make it, to scale up the production of it, maybe that's also an opportunity to rethink the way we produce the materials and the way we make use of them.
Just a quick question, because I remember when we talked last week, I think you mentioned that two-thirds of like a whole architecture in the world is actually not made by professional architects. Is it, I remember it well, or I totally made it up?
Yes, you remember it well. Yeah.
Because I was like, no, this is unbelievable. It kind of it came to me with a delay, and then I was thinking about it.
Actually, it's more than that. I mean, that's the one figure that I know. So it's basically two-thirds of the architecture, the built environment all over the world is earth-based constructions. So it's not directly linked to the fact that it's vernacular or not planned or etc. etc. But basically, I would say in a way that is provocative, even if it's not my intention. But the practice of architecture and the position of the architect is one that is common for planned and in a way privileged architecture. So I mean, basically an architecture that has the meanings of following codes, of following cultural aesthetics and such. I'm not saying that the rest of the architecture is slums, and that's not at all what I'm saying. I mean, it's basically most of architecture that people are building themselves, and they refer to other systems. There is this keyword, probably, I don't know if it's really a movement more than that, that is bioarchitecture, where we try to use biological systems and make architecture with it. Typically, mycelium composites are quite illustrative of this movement. The one quality of mycelium composite is that you can aggregate as much agricultural waste, say wood dust and such. So basically, waste and locally available substrates that you bind or that you have binded with a mycelium of wood decaying fungus. The one quality of that is that you can make it very vernacular, which means taking into consideration the resources that you have at hand. And I think it's a good opportunity to think about what vernacular means. And actually, in environmentally stressed areas, such as in the Middle East, for instance, this also means that the scarcity of resources, there is also a scarcity of human resources and within the community. So basically, you build with the competencies that you have also, not only with the materials that you have. All these practices, and that's why also, in a way, we link these material practices to the social aspect. It's also because it can be vernacular. It can be tools, materials for social resilience. It's also an opportunity for education, which means also maybe improving the way we do open source and the way we share knowledge.
This conversation revolved around design, with kombucha as a tool for social inclusion or mycelium as a material to build a vernacular architecture. These approaches show the limitations of a largely hyped human-centered design and its anthropocentric paradigm. Design for humans, who are an equal and inseparable part of a larger system, convinces me much more though. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. I'm always looking forward to hearing from you at hello@fermentradio.com. Ferment Radio is brought to you by Culture of Cultures and is produced by Super Eclectic. Thank you for listening, keep fermenting, and stay tuned to the next episode of Ferment Radio.